Wonderful. So as Anna rightly said, I've been working a lot on the division of paid and unpaid work between genders, but also career development. And I've actually in the last few years developed more into a little political sociologist, you could say. And my research agenda that I'm now pursuing with papers that are now submitted or are going to be written, I think is something that I want to do more broadly, because I think that people that do demography and family sociology have a lot to add to these ongoing debates about political conflict. And that's where I want to, say, guys, there's a field and it's lying there like empty, and we should go into it and, do our type of research in this field and to inform the debates. So today I'm going in recent decades. Yeah, so 60 years. And as you might know, one of the very prominent debates that many of you might be very familiar with is the stalled gender revolution. And in some countries, we're even seeing evidence of a reversal of the gender revolution, which means after decades of changing gender relations towards more equality and equity, both in rights, but also in terms of divisions of paid and unpaid work, and gender ideologies we've seen all over Europe and the US. We now more recently see research, of which my own research has been part, that apparently new gender essentialist ideologies are coming forth. And that was pretty much a surprise for many people to see what's going on there. So obviously there's a new type of conflict in both the political and the private realm, because what you see in the gender ideology field is kind of also mirrored in the family policy realm, where you see that countries differ in how much gender equality they actually foster, but also within countries you have sometimes really contradictory, conflictual policies in how to handle paid work and care. One example of what this new looks like, this is taken from Knight and Brinton, the seminal study, and they showed us over time. So you see between 1990 and 2008 in 3 waves using the EVS data that gender traditionalism clearly declined and that egalitarianism increased, as we would have expected it in the simple way of putting things. But then comes the big surprise. When you do the math between the traditionalists and the egalitarianists, in 2009, they cover less than half of the population in the 17 countries that they looked at. And where are everybody else? They have different gender ideologies that we didn't have on our radar until recently. And Knight and Brinton call these mixed ideologies that we see here, egalitarian familialism on the one hand, and that seems to be a rather same, and another group they call flexible egalitarianism. That is a group that increased in size pretty much between the 1990s and the 2000s. So what do these new profiles look like? What kind of people are they? And this is, I think, why I now show you our own research. We were in the review process at the same time as Knight and Brinton, and we were at JMF. And so what we see is here, the top line shows what everybody would have expected. If you look at the bottom line of this graph, you see egalitarian and traditional statements to this gender ideology. Mother can have just a warm relationship with children than mothers who don't work. Preschool children suffer when the mother is, and more to the right, fathers are as well suited to look after children as mothers. And in a in a unipolar world, you would expect to find these egalitarianists who respond rather in egalitarian ways to all of these items. And you would also expect to find a traditional group. This is the group we labeled here as traditional. It's really small in our data, where people actually tend to give traditional answer consistently through all of these items. And here you already see even this traditional group is not actually that traditional when it comes to their conditional probability of agreeing with the statements that men, or disagreeing with the statements that fathers are as well suited to look after their children as mothers. And the really important other groups that we identified, and this is very much similar to also produced, but we used also qualitative research to interpret these clusters, is first of all a group that we labeled Egalitarian Essentialists, which are people who are rather positive towards female employment. So they're rather at the high end when it comes to mothers' employment, and also to fathers' participation at home. But they actually think what women really want is to be a housewife and to have children, and that this is what women actually want and what they're made for. Then we found a moderate traditional group that is also rather small, around 7.3%. So they have a medium likelihood to agree or disagree with these statements. And then we have a cluster that we identified or interpreted as a group that is supporters of intensive parenting. And that is a literature strongly in qualitative research who identified this pattern. These are people who really put the best interest of the child first. They think parenthood is an endeavor where you have to invest first and foremost into your child. And the primacy should be with the child's mother. This is why this profile is so super critical towards working mothers. But they also recognize that men not only can bring home the money, they also should support with the childcare to get the best child outcomes. And these profiles, as you see, really mix very traditional and very egalitarian statements in new ways. And by now, so this was 2018, by now we've seen a really broad research that really supports these results, refines these results. So this is robust in a way. So this is the one type of change we've seen and the irritation we see when it comes to gender. Then further findings regarding these gender ideologies is that the size of these gender, it varies within work-family policy regimes. So you wouldn't find the same sizes in the group profiles for Germany as compared to Sweden, as compared to Spain, for instance. And we've also seen that these ideologies are relational in the sense that if you look then at the couple level, men and women tend to be rather similar in the way they agree or disagree with these statements. So there's a lot of couple similarity going on. The similarity apparently increases over time. And we also see then, of course, there are also couples who disagree with these, with their gender ideologies. And we see that leads to bargaining in the couples. So it's really then financial resources that are, to put your foot down, to have it your way, basically. So okay, so since nobody's speaking, I continue speaking. So apparently both in the public and the political concern regarding social cohesion and social solidarity is going on. So people start getting worried what's going on in Europe, and the attitudinal dimensions are obviously important to that. And final point to motivate this research agenda that I put up, there's also a rising public interest in gender issues again. It's sometimes framed as a so-called gender backlash or a gender anti-genderism debate. And that means that after decades of political correctness towards more egalitarianism and more gender inclusive language and orientations that are uttered in public, all of a sudden anti-feminist views reappear in the public and political debate, much less restricted than they used to be. And of course, I have a sense of what that means in your country where you're at the moment. And this type of debate happens next to the egalitarian discourses we're seeing. So all these three types of change and conflict that I just pointed out have the stoic gender revolution and reversion, the communitarian cosmopolitan divide, and the gender backlash discussion. They have gender equality and equity of human beings written all over them. So there's a lot these debates have in common. They're also observable not in single countries, but really across Europe and beyond, with, of course, differences in heatedness of debates and salience. But yet research has paid very little attention to how these different strands of debates might be linked. And this is what I try to get into with a number of research projects from different angles right now. So based on this gap, the research agenda is made up by 5 running research projects that started in 2021. 3 of them are part of longer long-term research groups. Anna mentioned the RIS research group, which is one of the really major milestones we have, but we have other research that started in this direction. And the idea is that we want to assess whether and how gender ideologies link to other political orientations, namely, for instance, to things like attitudes towards migration, attitudes towards the EU, or national versus cross-national conceptions of social solidarity, so the communitarian cosmopolitan divide aspects, whether and how gender ideologies link to party preferences, for especially the political agenda that relates to climate change, equity and equal rights more generally, or the left-right spectrum, because that would give us a sense to understand whether parties really cater into a general egalitarian and liberatist audience, or whether these are very different debates targeted towards different audiences. And finally, whether and how gender ideologies and political orientations and party preferences are related to another in terms of how they're transmitted within families, especially couples, how they are informed by group membership. This is what we do in the RIS project most intensely, and how they also affect behavior and other outcomes. And after this general introduction into this research agenda, we will focus today on a paper that is about transmission of political orientations within couples. And this is an important topic, as I will argue, because if you look at the research from the US, and this is the leading research right now, there's a lot to worry about what's going on in households to destabilize societies and actually to undermine social cohesion. And so now I'm going to present you this specific paper that's under review currently that I conducted together with Ansgar Hode. And we ask, why do romantic partners often prefer the same political party? Why is that important? And we do that based on data from Germany. What we know in general, if you look into this literature, is that political homogamy, which is defined in our paper as both partners leaning towards the same or a similar political party, that this type of political homogamy is actually high throughout. So, and if you look at the literature, there's a lot of studies suggesting that assortative mating is a key principle in the partner market. And we know that is true for social class, for cultural preferences, for education, for race and ethnicity. So political homogamy is yet another sorting mechanism that forms couples. We also know that political traits in themselves are important for voting behavior, party preferences, and political attitudes. For all of these variables, we see very high levels of homogamy besides of the homogamy levels that you might know from other research and other areas of research. In fact, and that was new to me when I first read it, political homogamy is actually higher than educational homogamy, for instance. It's also higher than gender role attitude homogamy or lifestyle homogamy. And we also thought we know, the longer the relationship duration, the higher the political homogamy we see. So that was the state of research when we started researching this. Why is that now important beyond people who are interested in families and couples by nature? So this is the really important slide when I talk to my political science colleagues, because if you look at the US context that is very much politically divided, you see evidence that households basically work as mini filter bubbles. So if partners are politically homogamous, they have a very high chance to also have an impact on what their children think about politics. And we've also seen a lot of evidence from the US that the more political conflict there is within a country, the more homogeneous the social networks of households become. So you are less likely to continue to stay friends with people who have a different position from your own. So in principle, that means if households become mini filter bubbles in terms of political orientation, that would increase political division and would undermine social cohesion. And that in turn, if you can trust the US data we have, increases the preference for homogamy further. So there is a potentially vicious cycle that drives, in addition to other processes, of course, the divisions within countries. Now, I think it's important to assess how much worried we need to be. It depends on how homogamy actually works, what causes it, and what can we do about it, basically, and is it really a problem? And there are three major theories that we address in the paper and that are out there on the literature. The first one is that people select their partners based on political preferences. So when you start dating somebody, you find out rather soon what their political opinions are. And then if the partner wouldn't match on that level, you would consider him or her not an appropriate partner for yourself. The more prominent debate that many of you and I were familiar with right from the start is that selection primarily works via socioeconomic status. So you meet somebody who's like you because you have much higher chances to meet within the same social strata. And then the political homogamy is just a byproduct of the similarity of sharing the same social class experiences. And so these two theories are about the matching process. So who becomes partners in the first place? The third theory or hypothesis is about alignment. That means no matter how you met and matched your partner, that partners become more similar over time. They align their political ideas and preferences. So looking in more detail at the state of research and the theoretical arguments on selection on politics, I think the study by Zuckerman and others is the most important one in that respect. And they argue that the expression of political attitudes is part of everyday life and that much of this happens in households and with the partner actually. We also know from qualitative research that it's actually really difficult when you discover that somebody you're really emotionally attached to, so your partner or your children, has different political stances that concern moral and ethical questions. Because when you love somebody, you cannot negotiate these standpoints in an objective way. It really restricts the partnership quality and it really makes it difficult to communicate about this at all. So this would also be a reason to form a homogamous partnership in terms of politics. We also know from social psychology that it just feels good to be surrounded by people who share your opinion. And that includes, of course, partner and family, because that reassures you, it gives you a feeling of being right and being, safe with people who agree. So there's a lot of feel-good power to being around people who are like you and not people who have a different opinion. And when you look at the empirical evidence that's out there, and that's for now, as far as I know, limited to the US, it is indeed true in survey experiments when they matched potential dating partners with political preferences. So they added artificial information on people's political orientation, then the interview person was more likely to find that profile interesting if the person had matching political preferences to their own political preferences. And we further know, because in the US there are actually dating platforms where political opinions are expressed, that online dating behavior is also affected by this. So when a partner sees a potentially interesting matching or partner profile, then there is a higher likelihood of contact initiation when the partner has corresponding political preferences. Moving on to selection on socioeconomic status. We know, I think, from many studies, it's very well established that couples do match on socioeconomic status characteristics. But the important thing to consider is this only leads to political homogamy if, in addition to couples matching on socioeconomic status, there also is an association between socioeconomic status and political preferences to begin with. And that association needs to be strong, otherwise that's not happening. And third of all, this association between socioeconomic status and political preferences needs to be similar for women and men, at least when you look at the matching of heterosexual couples. Otherwise, it also doesn't really work out that way. And these conditions are rather tough to meet. But I would have said, like, from my stomach before I did this research, yeah, that will be it, because these people are just very alike. And then finally, coming to the alignment literature, which looks at the process of being together in a relationship and looking at alignment over time. We see evidence of that according to research. And why do we see that? Well, first of all, partners mutually influence each other when they discuss politics and everyday life at the kitchen table. The likelihood is high that I am influenced by what my partner says and my partner is influenced by what I say. But also, people share the same living conditions in overlapping social networks. So there's also a lot of input from the outside of the partnership itself that should cater alignment over time. So that all sounds like, why did you do a study? It's all known. Then I was super surprised when I looked into these studies that they have a lot of methodological flaws, really, based on how we would nowadays model things. And the first is that if you look at the matching literature, they often only consider married couples as recent matches or couples that have been cohabiting for a really long time. And that means in order to really enter the being considered as a match, people actually have to survive as a couple relationship for a really long time. And that is, of course, given that many people never marry to begin with, and given that matching should be somehow initial to really separate it from alignment, that doesn't make sense. So in our study, we study young couples as soon as they move in together into the same household. This is the first moment when we catch them. And on average, this is 7 months after they move in together. The second really important gap in the literature, and that really got me surprised, was alignment. So this process over time is hardly ever measured within the same couple. It's usually measured using cross-sectional data and comparing like couples that have been together for 10 years to couples in the same data set that have been together for 2 years. And there are all kinds of selection processes going on when you look at that, especially because homogamous couples are more likely to be stable couples over time. So the couples become more and more selective the older the longer the relationship duration, but also, and that brings us to the third point, political landscapes change over time. So when you live in a two-party system, you have a very high likelihood to meet somebody who agrees with you politically. When you live in a multi-party system that is very fragmented, chances are just much lower. And if countries move from one extreme to the next, that's also mixed up with alignment. So we study alignment within the same couples over time. And moving on to the argument I already referred to, we also consider changes on the macro level, because that is really important, both in just pure statistical sense, but also in terms of interpreting likelihoods of meeting somebody who's really like you or not like you with regard to policies or politics. And just on a side note, which is, I think, based also on the data restrictions, there are hardly any studies that really test the three different main mechanisms in the literature against each other, and at least not in a serious way. So our paper is really one of the first who really goes into these mechanisms and try to model them so that they can really provide different parts of the answers. Of course, the the hypotheses are not strictly separate or counter hypotheses, but of course, when you are already selected to a maximum of homogamy, there's little room for alignment. And on the other hand, if people do not select their partners on socioeconomic status, there's a lot of room for alignment over time. So we're testing these three hypotheses: selection on party preference, indirect selection via socioeconomic traits, and alignment over time. How do we do that? For the two matching hypotheses, so the first two hypotheses, we compare real couples as they show up in the data with counterfactual couples, where we split the real couples and once remarry them or remate them to maximize their political homogamy so that we get them as homogamous as possible. That's the one benchmark we set for the real couples. Then we remarry them once or rematch them randomly so that you just get any random partner that's available. And that again takes into account that some people are part of like large parties and others are partisans of small parties. And then the third counterfactual is we rematched couples so to maximize their socioeconomic status, so that they're matched by socioeconomic status. And that gives you a measure to compare the real couples against and to get an idea of which of the hypotheses might be correct. If selection on party preferences is the key mechanism, then real couples should be much more leaning towards the maximum political homogamy extreme than the couples that were somewhere matched on socioeconomic status, and they should be far away from the pure random matching. If political homogamy is just a byproduct of socioeconomic traits, then the matched couples on socioeconomic status should be rather close in their political orientations towards the real couples. And then if we look at alignment as the key mechanisms, we should observe a convergence of party preferences within the same couples over time, while holding macro level heterogeneity in the political landscape constant. And none of this has been done in previous research as far as we know. We are lucky to have data that allow us to do that. It's the German socioeconomic panel data. It's dyadic data with direct infos from both partners. We restricted the sample to different sex couples because we don't have enough cases among the homosexual couples to distinguish them in the analysis. The analytic sample for matching, where we really observe them as soon as they move in together, is 2,500 couples. Alignment we can study for 3,900 couples with 26,400 observations. And we provide separate analysis because the German political landscape actually changed a lot. So we separate couples that matched between 1980 and the 2000, and those who matched or became a couple from 2000 onwards until I think the data go up to 2019 or 20. So we compared two 20-year windows broadly. The main dependent variable is, do you lean towards a particular party? And it's important to acknowledge, I was shocked when I first saw it, but that's the way it is everywhere around the world. 51% of men and 62% of women have no party preference whatsoever. So they would answer, no, I don't have a party preference, or I don't lean towards a political party. If they say yes, it's asked, which party do you lean toward? And then you can either use the specific party information to create your dependent variable, or you can create party groups. That's one of the things we did. So we grouped the parties that people gave us as center left, center right, and right. And this is how we constructed three versions of our dependent variable. The first dependent variable is the most straightforward and the most strict one. We consider couples as homogamous when they really lean towards the same political party. Every other constellation is considered not a match. Then we created a bit of a lighter measure of homogamy, political homogamy. That includes, of course, the full party matching, but also when the people prefer parties that it. And then the matched couples for maximum socioeconomic homogamy, that was done a little differently. You sorted the couples ascending or descending, depending on how you wish. We did it descending, and then we started with the most prestigious men, so with the highest socioeconomic status, matched that man to the woman in the data set with the highest socioeconomic status, and then we went to the second, third, yeah. And then alignment is done using linear probability models with couple level fixed effects to take care of everything we don't need then to control for. Our outcome variable is party political homogamy, again with these 3 dependent variables as outcomes. And the main predictor is then, of course, cohabitation duration locked. And we do 2 types of models, the so-called A models, that do not control for macro level heterogeneity. So this is only couple level fixed effects. Do partners really become more similar within the same relationship duration? And the second model is also a kind of counterfactual, controlling for macro level heterogeneity. How would couple partners similarity change if relationship duration on the society level remain constant? And this is we do by creating a macro measure where we look at the probability that any 2 randomly matched women and men are homogamous. And then we do that separately for every year. So we see the random chance of being homogamous and how that changes over time. And we do that based on the full sample. And now we move to the result. This is just the descriptive findings, but I think they're already rather indicative regarding the likelihood of really forming a couple with somebody who's from a different party family. And you see both men and women, and we separated here the couples that formed before 2000 and the couples that formed from 2000 onwards. You see that throughout, the likelihood of having a partner that really leans towards a different party from a different party group is rather small. So of course, larger, the smaller the party partisanship is, but in general, people tend to be together with somebody who agrees with the same party or party family, or who then has no party preference at all. But this is just descriptives over the full sample. Now we move on to the results regarding our hypothesis. And here you see for the couples that were formed before 2000, you see the range that is possible between maximum homogamy. So the range of maximum homogamy, according to the data, is a little bit smaller than 0.3. And the random matching in the data is a little bit larger than 0.07 or 0.08. And this is where we find the real couples. So basically halfway. So the blue dot is the real couples. They are really halfway between the maximum homogamy couples and the randomly matched couples, which clearly shows this process is not random. There is selection going on. And then the red cross shows you it's obviously not socioeconomic matching that drives this process, because the socioeconomic matched couples are close to the randomly matched couples. And so we also did that for the differently strict dependent variables. You see the story always remains the same. And you also see that the younger cohort consistently has a lower likelihood of being matched, except for the both no preference dependent variable, than the other cohorts. So apparently matching declined a little bit over time, as you can see in the descriptives, but the theoretical mechanism is the same. And now we turn to alignment. And here you see the so-called A models. They don't control for the macro level heterogeneity in political preferences. And then the B models that do control for this. And what you would expect is that the month of cohabitation, so the first 2 rows, they should be highly significant. And in a similar way for the older cohort and the later cohort, in order to say, yes, alignment is taking place. And what we see here now is for our strictest measure of homogamy, namely preferring the same political party, you see nothing, neither for the younger cohort nor for the older cohort. For the party group homogeneity, you see a little effect, but only for the older cohort, and it's really weak. And for the large chunk of people who also can agree on not having a party preference, you see a clear effect for the older cohort, but not for the later cohabitation cohort. And now it's interesting to look at the B models because they show you how much more alike these very same couples would have been keeping the macro level heterogeneity constant. And there you see clearly more of the picture that you would have expected, but also it's not as pronounced as it should have been theoretically. So you see for the strict definition of political homogamy, the effects are now visible. So there is alignment going on, but it's obviously completely outweighed by the dynamics on the macro level in Germany. For the party group, we only find this effect for the older cohort, but not for the younger cohort. And in the most or least restrictive measure, you see very small and very weakly significant effects for both cohorts. To give you an idea of what the effect strength means, after controlling for the changes in the political landscape, a couple that would have formed before 2000 would have had a 16% probability to prefer the same party in this model. And after 10 years, that probability would have gone up to 28%. And for the younger cohort, couples that formed after 2000, so the initial level after 3 months to correspond with the same party is lower, it's only 10%. And after 10 years, it would have risen only to 14%. And these effects are completely canceled out in the real world by the heterogenization of the political landscape. So to conclude, in line with other previous research, we do find strong homogamy in political party preference among newly cohabiting couples. And we do see that this homogamy actually slightly decreases over time. So going back to the initial slides on the echo chamber scenario, which is really visible and clearly seen for the US, we do not see this at all. Rather, these associations have become weaker over time. We also see that political homogamy is not explained by socioeconomic homogamy, rather the contrary. And that is important because it means that increases in socioeconomic homogamy, something we actually see for Germany. So couples become more similar and similar with relation to socioeconomic status. It does not lead to socio-political closure. So there's no reason to assume that the socioeconomic homogamy drives this echo chamber mechanism. In terms of our theory, it's also clear that hypothesis 1, direct political matching, is supported while hypothesis 2 is not supported. And as I said, alignment is visible as an effect, but it's completely cancelled out in the German situation by macro level heterogenization of the political landscape. So this is important because it would say in Germany, at the moment, we don't see any reason to be worried about trends of homogamy, but would the parties now, develop differently, or if we lived in a two-party system, or if the two-party system then became more extreme, this pattern would look very differently. So, of course, we also have a number of limitations and open questions. For example, do couples really match on politics, or is it some close correlate of it that we don't have in the data? I think that's the obvious one. But also, we did, I think, the best job we could with the data at hand to get couples early on. But of course, you all might know it takes some time from saying I'm in a couple to really having moved in together. And that might, of course, also say there might be pre-cohabitation alignment that we cannot capture with our data.